The year is 1576 and Dracula is reborn. It's time to get the help of the Belmonts, the almighty clan of vampire killers. With his monster-vanquishing whip, it's Christopher Belmont who sets off on a casual stroll into Castlevania. Seriously, he has no sense of urgency. I can't show off any main part of the game without revealing how sluggish he is, so I'm mentioning it right away. Castlevania The Adventure is Konami's third release game with Castlevania in the title, and the first on the Game Boy, starting a new series on the new handheld system. The first two released on the NES starring Simon Belmont, who is never exactly known for his speed, but Christopher is very much known for his lack of it. This Game Boy series started a little over 100 years before the events of the NES titles, so maybe evolution helped the Belmonts to move just a little faster. The Game Boy first launched in Japan in 1989, and Konami had a tough task in releasing Castlevania The Adventure later that year. Or is it the Castlevania Adventure? The logo doesn't exactly make it clear, and in fact there's still some confusion on the internet 35 years later. It is officially confirmed to be Castlevania The Adventure, but you can look up either and find the right game. Perhaps the confusion still exists because the game wasn't all that popular in sales, or too well loved by those who did play it. Notably, on a system with a tiny screen and no color, somehow the graphics are very detailed. It's impressive that they looked this good so soon after the system's release, with the artists proving that they didn't need color to make a good-looking game. Perhaps this shouldn't be a surprise though, since Castlevania games had always cracked the code to make good graphics. The music also makes a good impression, which was to be expected as well with Konami and Castlevania. It's a shame that our friend Christopher didn't also give a good first impression. These days, Castlevania The Adventure somewhat lives in infamy because, as referenced right at the start, you could describe Christopher as painfully slow. It's a pretty shocking first impression and there's no way around that. Other than this slow movement, he can jump above his own height but barely cover any distance, and he can also use his whip on any enemies along the way. And that's about it. It's a limited selection of moves without any additional items or weapons to be picked up on the journey, just a vampire killer and his vampire killer. It will always be difficult to talk about a Game Boy game without addressing the hardware limitations, which surely played a part here. If you look at the home console releases, there are always additional items. That being said, I appreciated the simplicity a lot as the game went on. A frequent feature of the levels is candles on the walls, which can be whipped into something entirely different. This is a returning feature from the very first Castlevania, where breaking the candles could reveal a new weapon, and most often would drop hearts, which were actually ammo for that weapon. We already know there are no additional weapons, but hearts will sometimes drop from candles, and this time their function makes sense. It's simply a small health refill. The Adventure's candles will most commonly drop something to increase the score, which is ultimately unhelpful since most of us are just trying to beat the game. The most important candle drops are the crystals, which signal that Christopher's whip has become more powerful. There are 3 different whips for Christopher to use. The base whip, known as the Mystic Whip, is short and not as powerful. Discovering a crystal will upgrade the whip to the Morning Star, which is longer and deals double the damage. One more crystal will allow the Morning Star to shoot fireballs, which is a debut in the series. This fireball whip is cool, and that's about the biggest compliment it will get from me. I wanted the fireballs to be useful as a ranged attack, but they really weren't. In a game featuring all kinds of undead enemies, fire should be very harmful, and yet I rarely found an enemy that was affected by it. Even those that did take damage took very little compared with a direct whip strike. That's disappointing, but I was happy with the power of the Morning Star. Unfortunately, the whip somehow added yet another layer of infamy. In this game, where you already move at a snail's pace, there were additional punishments put in place for taking damage. Castlevania on the NES was very much known for its difficulty, and the whole series has a health bar that depletes whenever enemies hit you. That wasn't enough for Castlevania The Adventure. If you had an upgraded whip, it gets downgraded if you take any damage, and that's your only attack. Being at a health disadvantage is never good, so it didn't need to get any worse. This was never the case in previous games, not even with the additional items. Only a death would reset you back to the base gear, but in this game, you might die because you were unexpectedly back down to the default. Nope, nothing about the overall mechanics sounds like a good idea to me. It turns out that this is the most common opinion, and many people couldn't bring themselves to play extensively. For that reason, maybe this game is just a little misunderstood. I'm not going to call it a good game or defend it from being called a bad game, but it's actually surprisingly easy to get used to this movement. I am also here to offer you a nuclear opinion. I would rather play this than Castlevania 1 on the NES. Now hold on, the Flynn Rider treatment might be deserved if I told you Castlevania The Adventure is the better game, but that's not what I'm saying, and it's not even close. It's just that the simplicity here makes it quicker and easier to learn to play, and the level design is overall very creative. Many of the challenges presented in the level design revolve around platforming instead of being centered around enemies. I like this approach considering Christopher's simplified weapon choice. I don't like that it's Christopher doing the platforming. There are some genuinely good ideas in the design that get ruined by Christopher's terrible movement. The walk speed is one thing, but the jumping involves a little too much trial and error, which is not what you want for platforming. The jump arc would benefit from being wider, giving you more airtime. The first level attempts to teach the jumping by having the player execute several of the same jumps in a row without the penalty of death, but there are other elements that can throw you off. For example, you might be jumping to a platform with an enemy moving back and forth, or you could be dealing with platforms that fall when you jump on them. Those challenges were very common in gaming, but were questionable with this game's physics. It's also entirely possible that you can forget how close to the edge you need to be in order to jump across a gap, and yes, I'm speaking from experience. In addition to these jumping challenges, some of the platforming along the way will instead prevent jumping entirely. No, it's not because of the stairs that have always functioned bizarrely in the series. There are no stairs to be seen anywhere. Instead, there are many ropes to climb and you can't jump from them, which makes challenges like the upward autoscroller in Stage 3 appear very unpolished. Still, it was probably the right choice to go with all this platforming because the enemy-based challenges all felt lazy. This is best shown by all the repetitive statues at the start of Stage 4. As much as I want to talk more positively about the game, we somehow still haven't addressed all of the elephants in the room. This elephant over here has a tiny room all to herself, as a really weird metaphor to say that the stages in this game are huge, but the overall game is very small. There are only 4 stages, that's it. I would cram 4 elephants into that room to show it better, but we've already had a few too many elephants in rooms, and if I had 4 elephants on screen at once, Christopher would be moving even slower than he already is, because the game can't keep up with all those sprites. Of course, the stages wouldn't take so long if the pace wasn't so slow, but at this length, the good music unfortunately turns boring. The loops aren't very long, and the music will last for the whole stage, only breaking up if you take a death. A death will bring you back to the last checkpoint, of which there are very few in a stage, but they're not in very obvious spots. I was surprised that not every room acts as a checkpoint. A game over, on the other hand, will send the player back to the beginning of the stage. Past pesky bats and rolling eyeballs, they'll explode too. Through a graveyard and a cave, slowly walking away from an incoming spike wall and dealing with other castle traps that seem far too mechanical for the 16th century, the adventure ends with Dracula. Every stage ends with a boss, and none of them have been too tricky up to this point, mostly because everything was simplified just for the whip. Dracula is lurking at the end of Stage 4, and this battle will take some time to figure out. But that's the same with the whole game. Give it some time and it won't be as hard as the original. This time isn't naturally built into the game since lives are very scarce, but it's not hard to learn Dracula's patterns to eventually win the battle. The gameplay ends when the fight is over, and Christopher escapes to watch the castle crumble from a faraway cliff. Don't mind the bat flying away from the ruins. This game is a rough one, and I understand why people call it a bad game. As I just mentioned, it's better if you give it a little time, which is the case for just its core mechanics. I saw this myself when it looped back to the start after Stage 4. Actually, it claimed it was Stage 5, but I found no differences with Stage 1, other than that I felt that I had improved at controlling Christopher. Sadly, even though I was able to control him more easily this time, it's kind of unforgivable how messy his whole situation is. The Game Boy wasn't ready for Castlevania, and even with Konami's signature excellent graphics, the game contains some screen-tearing issues. I even had to pause in the opening of Stage 4 because it was getting disgustingly hard to look at. There were a lot of good ideas in the game that would benefit from getting saved for later or moving to a different game altogether. Therefore, my final score for Castlevania The Adventure will be 5.4 out of 10. Upon release, reviews were largely very positive. It missed out on getting a Nintendo Power review, but notable magazine Electronic Gaming Monthly scored it 79 out of 100, complimenting the visuals, sound, and action. Most reviews from fans haven't looked that way for a long time, because everyone can see that it's a technical mess, giving it an average rating of under 50%. I would never recommend this game to a series outsider, but if you're good enough to beat the NES Castlevanias, you should be able to clear the adventure too. It's easier overall, and if you're willing to give it time, you might find it's not as bad as people say. It was remade for the Game Boy Color as part of Konami Game Boy Collection Volume 1, and then reimagined as Castlevania The Adventure Rebirth for a WiiWare game. The original Game Boy form is also available in the Castlevania Anniversary Collection. Tell me, did you agree with the points I've made? What rating would you give Castlevania The Adventure for the Game Boy, initially released in 1989? If you've made it this far, I hope you'll consider subscribing to see more, as well as liking the video. I can see that most review viewers aren't subscribed to the channel. As ever, thank you for watching, and please continue to be your own unique self. This is some Battletoads stuff.
So true.
It's the frickin' snakes in a cave. Well, it's not the snakes in a cave at all.
Right now you are just ejaculating facts.
It's just more impossible.
Excuse me.
Which